Okay, I would like to just say a very warm welcome to Werner Schlabber, who is the managing director of the Green Block Group. So before I met Werner, like many of us, maybe we've had quite a bit of a skewed perception of what is possible with timber in our industry. You know, what comes to mind immediately is roof trusses and maybe then a little bit of timber in the foyer, I don't know. But I never knew what could be done with timber. And I thought, well, you can't really go all high. There's all these fire risks. You know, I had so many misconceptions. And after attending Wood Conference and after meeting Werner and seeing what is actually possible, I said, look, please will you share this with all of us so that we could just educate ourselves and get to know what can be done. So over to you, Werner.
Thank you very much, Tisha, and very much appreciate the opportunity to share something that we're very, very passionate about in the Green Block Group. And as you said, I'm the managing director. We've got several companies, all specializing in different areas of timber construction, but timber frame, obviously, house building is our passion. Interesting enough, my great-grandfather was a master carpenter, and he was a German. So I think it's been in our family for a long time. We're a second-generation construction company in timber. And so this is absolutely a business that we run from a place of passion.
And with German precision.
Yes, we hope. We hope.
Fortunate.
So without further ado, let me take you through this process. I've named my presentation, Why on Earth Do You Want to Build with Timber? Which is a very good question. You know, we've in South Africa, exactly like you said, Letitia, there's a lot of misperception about timber. And we'll get to that a little bit later and understand, you know, what creates these misperceptions. So on the agenda today, we're going to look at, first of all, a couple of areas that affect our drive to build in timber and explain and give a little bit of a background why timber construction is such an important thing, not only for us on a personal level, but also, you know, for the world that we live in. And so I want to talk about a little bit about carbon pollution. There's a lot of misperception about it, and all the information that we are gathering is based on whatever science is giving us at this point. So I'll go through some of the basics in terms of where we're standing with carbon pollution. Then I want to just look at something called net zero buildings. I see some people call it zero net buildings. It's the same thing. It addresses an area where you can actually look at a building and see what contribution of carbon it actually makes, you know, to the atmosphere. Then I want to look at what is a timber home. Again, massive misperceptions in South Africa, especially about what a timber home actually is. Then we're going to look at why do we want to build with timber? You know, what are the benefits and even what are some of the disadvantages of building in timber? So let's rather be honest about everything so that we are able to make a fair decision whether timber construction is the correct methodology for a specific project. Then I want to look at some international construction trends. I think it's important to know where the rest of the world is going. You know, if you don't think the world is connected anymore, you certainly don't have a phone. But because we live in one world and something happens on the other side of the world, and I promise you the price at your petrol pump will tell you that we're all connected. Then I'm going to just talk about a little bit about timber usage in South Africa. You know, how much timber is available? What are we doing? Where do we stand in terms of timber? And then lastly, just what is the future and how do I see the future? And hopefully I can leave you with some ideas of what you can do to contribute to the future of construction. And I hope after this presentation in timber. All right. So the first thing that I want to look at is this whole thing about carbon. You've heard lots of things, and there's the media is full of information about carbon. Some of them say it's not such a big issue. Other people say it's not. So I've looked at some statistics that I think would be quite relevant. So there's a couple of different organizations that have plotted the average temperature across the last 100 years on Earth. So if you look at this graph, it's all the way from NASA right through to the guys in Japan. So it's right across the spectrum, and their graphs look very similar. And what you'll see is that we've increased the temperature from about 1970s, really. It started picking up to a point where on average the temperature across the world has risen by about 0.75 degrees. And that's something that we don't have to really argue about. This is very scientific, factual information, in regards to global warming. And so the next question that we have to ask, if we look at carbon pollution and what's happened with the carbon that we've added into the atmosphere, is there actually any correlation between those two? So I found a graph, and it's a little bit outdated. I think this is even from 2017, where you can actually see the amount of carbon that we've produced and added to the atmosphere over, again, the last 115 years. And you'll see that it's grown from about 2 billion tons in the beginning of the 1900s to over 36 billion tons by about 2017. And that number is now in excess of 40 billion tons per year. Now, I've had conversations with guys that have said to me, but you know what, one volcano that erupts, have you ever looked at the amount of carbon that it adds to the atmosphere? So my point on that is that those volcanoes still exist today, and they did before we added our own carbon pollution. So the fact of the matter is you have to add these things together if you want to get a true picture of where we're standing in terms of carbon pollution. And there's no way of not taking some responsibility for the fact that we're adding carbon to the atmosphere through man-made processes. And just a very simple way of explaining it, I found such an interesting little warning slide on a vehicle. And this will really help you understand the concept of global warming a little bit better. It actually comes with a warning. It says that process can kill kids and pets. And so an easy way to test it is if you take your vehicle and you park it in the sun in a parking lot and you return to the car an hour later, you'll find the temperature in the car is a lot hotter than the temperature outside. And that's by the fact that you've got a layer of which you think is transparent glass, but it still allows the UV into the vehicle and it heats up the inside of the vehicle. But unfortunately, the frequency changes of the temperature that enters into the vehicle that it can't escape the vehicle, so the temperature keeps on building inside the vehicle. So exactly the same thing happens when you look at basically your greenhouse gases that form a layer around Earth. So that in its right quantities actually controls Earth's temperature perfectly. So the sun still heats up the surface of the Earth, it generates heat. And if you don't have enough added, or if there's not excess additives like carbon in the atmosphere, it actually allows a certain amount of heat to escape and therefore perfectly regulates temperature to sustain life on Earth. But in a situation, for example, where we're adding, 40 plus billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year, you're actually then creating a layer that actually traps the temperature, the heat. And that actually starts the process of global warming. So it's a nice little simple explanation without having to go into a lot of technical details on how global warming actually works.
Yeah, that's actually very understandable. It's exactly like in a car. So what I do if I find and that has happened in a shopping center and there's somebody who left their dog in the car and the poor dog is busy dying in the car, then I find that lipstick works very well to write on the windshield, because it's sticky and it's difficult to clean. And I think that drives the message home without doing any permanent harm, because believe me, I would rather smash out the window, but I know that's not legal.
Listen, I think that's such a good example. So I would want to say this presentation would be the lipstick to the world.
Yes.
All right. So just in terms of, I've mentioned before the amount of carbon that's added to the atmosphere. And, I think the alarming thing is that this is an exponential graph. It's actually not growing at a steady rate. We actually, it really is growing. Well, in 2007, it was growing by 2%. And we're getting to a point where it really is becoming a concern to us. So another thing I thought was quite interesting is to see, where does South Africa sit in terms of this whole scale? And, we're sitting in 16th place. So considering how small our population is, I think it's actually an alarming big number for the amount of carbon that we actually as a country contribute to the atmosphere. And as you'll see a little bit later, a large percentage of our carbon contribution actually comes from the cement industry and purely by the fact that we build in brick and mortar. And we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. When we started developing South Africa as a country, we were not a country that was very rich in natural forests. And so we had a lot of sand, obviously, and we had the ability to create bricks. And from there, it's an industry that naturally developed. But over time, we've created a lot of sustainable plantations, and we'll cover a lot more detail a little bit later on in the presentation, on that. But as at the end of the day, we're at a point now where we need to look at the amount of CO2 that we're producing through the construction process and certainly the manufacturing of cement. And so statistically, they say the cement industry accounts for around 5% of global CO2 emissions. And that's actually quite a big number, considering all the other components that add to that. Forest fires, all sorts of things like this, deforestation, all of those things have an impact. And then the other thing that's alarming is that the cement industry is still growing by about 2.5% annually. So it's expected to rise from 2.5 billion tons 2006 to about 4.4 billion tons by 2050. So I'm sure if you work in the cement industry, it's not the message that you want to hear. You're probably very happy that your industry is growing, but I think from a responsible perspective, cement and concrete will always have a place in construction. But I think the overuse of it is actually what the problem is. I like this slide because, people don't necessarily understand where cement comes from and where timber comes from. The one is completely natural. It comes from a forest, and the only thing you need to do is you need to actually take that piece of timber, dry it, treat it, cut it to size. You add very little carbon through that process. And then obviously transporting it, either to a factory or transporting it, to a sawmill, and from the sawmill, wherever it's going to go. But through the cement process, that's actually a process where the cement is manufactured, and it has a massive amount of carbon that it produces. So at the source, these two processes look very, very different.
And is it not also true that for the cement, there's mining that happens, that mining is an additional pollutant, whereas with timber, the tree actually provides oxygen while it's growing, which is
Yes.
a positive to the environment compared to mining, which, we have to mine for the minerals we need to make cement, and that's a further negative.
Yeah, the whole process, the whole grave, from inception to grave, that whole process actually unfortunately adds carbon to the process.
And we still need the transport. So we can't say, yeah, but we transport timber, but because we transport the cement as well.
Yes,
the concrete. Yeah.
Yes, unfortunately we do. And that's why the next graph is quite interesting. I'm comparing something I found in the UK where they've compared the amount of carbon on a 300 square meter house. And they've taken elements like concrete, for example, and compared it to a timber floor structure and a steel structure. You can see that concrete has by far the highest contribution, about 12 tons of CO2 that you will be releasing into the atmosphere, where the timber, it's a lot lower. It's about 2 tons. And if you wonder, because carbon obviously gets stored in timber, if you only look at a piece of timber without the process, has a negative carbon footprint. But the reason it doesn't have a negative is you still need a truck to transport it. There are still processes involved to cut it, treat it, etc. But you can look at those different areas, and you'll see that timber it's a lot lighter in terms of its carbon pollution. So if you look at other things there, for example, a brick wall, compared to a timber frame wall, etc. So you can make your own conclusions around that. Okay, so another interesting little statistic in total. If you're looking at a house approximately the same size, by the time you've built it in brick and mortar, you've contributed about 80 tons of CO2 in total. And 80 tons is actually a lot of CO2. It's equivalent to the manufacturing of 5 new family cars. It's about 6 years of living for the average Brit. And this obviously comes from the Guardian in the UK, so we don't know how other people live, but that's probably a good average for the rest of the world. And the equivalent of 24 economy class trips to Hong Kong, from London. So it has a big impact. If you're building a couple of thousand houses a year, you can work out the total carbon contribution. Okay, and as we have alluded to a little bit, so the statistic is that through the growth cycle of a tree, it actually removes 1 ton of carbon from the atmosphere through the whole process, and some of it is stored inside the tree. So when you cut down the piece of timber, you've got embodied carbon in the timber, and when you build it into your house, you've actually permanently removed it and stored it. Unless you take that piece of timber and you throw it in a fire so that you can release the carbon again, you've permanently removed it from the atmosphere. And so it's not just timber. Any kind of plant that you plant actually has a positive effect. So you can never plant enough, but timber is great by the fact that you can actually use the end product as it is and use that embodied carbon. Okay, so that's a little bit of an introduction to carbon pollution and what it is. There's a lot more research you can do on your own and go and get into a lot of detail. The next area that I want to look at is what's known as a zero net or net zero carbon building. So as we look at carbon, people are starting to say, listen, we need to actually have buildings that we can know that actually limits the amount of carbon that it adds to the atmosphere. And the point is to try and get to an area where a building doesn't use, and I'll read what it says here. It's a highly efficient building that produces on-site or procures enough carbon-free renewable energy to meet building operations or the building's operational energy consumption annually. Now, why would timber building really be a benefit if you're trying to create a carbon neutral building? Is because you've started with timber that already has a negative carbon footprint. And so if you can imagine building that building out of concrete, if it's 80 tons for a small 2-bedroom house, you can imagine if you're building a block of flats or you're building a big commercial building, the amount of tonnage. So you're really starting on a very negative, in a very negative situation, and then to be able to save the carbon, you buy credits, do whatever, is actually going to be very difficult. And so really, this is an idea that's pushed by the Green Building Councils. They operate in a couple of countries, and their goal is to get all buildings to net zero carbon by 2050. I think it's extremely ambitious, but at least they do have that goal in mind. And so those are existing buildings, and they would like all new buildings to operate at net zero by 2030. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done to offset the carbon that we do produce and the carbon that was initially produced by manufacturing the building or just building the building. And yeah, so the idea is obviously for net zero to become the standard so that we don't have this very expensive and major retrofits in existing buildings in the foreseeable future.
I can even add there that for the landlords or the construction companies and property developers who build buildings to keep them as income producing assets, they really prefer green buildings for the simple reason that the operational expenditure is much lower. Yeah. You get better rentals because your bigger company, blue chip type tenants want to be seen in green buildings, so they are very keen to rent out, and they prepared to pay a premium for a green building. And then additionally, you get a better market or better value growth of that building. So if you should sell it at some stage in the future, the capital appreciation of the green buildings are much better than those that are not. So it makes financial sense. Yeah. But if we consider the net zero impact, it makes environmental sense as well.
Yeah. No, definitely. It's something that we should all strive towards. And just, green building councils, there's about 10 of them. There may be more now at the time that I initially did this presentation, and they operate in countries like Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, and if you can believe it, South Africa too. Obviously, you guys probably know that we do have a green building council. And, they look at different areas to try and make sure that they get to this net zero. So those are areas, for example, renewable energy generation. The energy, they use something called the energy intensity matrix. They look at the embodied carbon, which is very interesting to me. So it just makes so much sense using as much timber in your construction as possible. Then obviously lowering emissions. You don't want to have systems that that add a lot of carbon through those processes of heating or cooling the building, etc. And then obviously reducing your peak energy demand. to make sure that you don't use all your energy during peak demand, that you spread it across time. So they take this type of criteria, and we should feel very proud of the fact that we actually have some buildings. For example, the Hotel Verde in Cape Town, there's a rating system, and 6 stars is the highest rating that you can get towards net zero. And Hotel Verde in Cape Town has got a 6-star rating. So we should, as South Africans, pat ourselves on the back. We indeed are able to do it and to build these buildings. So something to be proud of. And so this is quite an interesting statement that came out in the New York Magazine. It says, we've been engineering in ignorance and then in denial a climate system that will now go to war with us for many centuries, perhaps until it destroys us. Now, I think there's enough attention on the matter that we probably would avoid that. I think that there's not a person on Earth anymore that is not aware of global warming and aware of this whole problem. So I think there's a lot being done. At the same time, I think that we can probably take it too far. I know that it can be a little bit extreme in terms of, controlling what people do, and you don't want to remove people's freedom of right to live and to build, etc. But there's certainly, we're at a point where there is a problem. Okay, so the last part of my discussion on carbon, I just want to touch a little bit on carbon tax. And I'll explain to you why I think that's a good thing. Most people don't like taxes, but I do think this is one area where there really is an opportunity for us. So just to define carbon tax, because we're not very familiar with that in South Africa, carbon tax is a form of pollution tax, and it levies a fee on the production, distribution, or use of fossil fuels based on how much carbon their combustion emits. Excuse me. The government sets a price per ton of carbon and then translates it into a tax on electricity, natural gas, or oil. And actually have a list here of what different countries have done in terms of carbon tax and how they implement it. And then I'll share my thoughts on why I think it's a good thing. And so one of the things that we've all done, including South Africa, is we've signed the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol actually has been put in place as a framework for us to help, as a whole world, deal with climate change. And the whole purpose of it is to cut CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Obviously, CO2 is not the only gas that contribute to creating an imbalance in greenhouse gases. It's not about the fact that they are natural gases, they should 100% be there. Otherwise, the Earth will cool down completely, but it's about managing the process. Now, what I'm fascinated by is the fact that South Africa has committed to a 34% reduction by 2020 and a 42% reduction by 2025. And if you need a reminder, we're in 2024 at the moment. So I hope that they've done more than what they've done to give us electricity in this country towards this, but I seriously think there's a long way for us to go. I think we're very far off these targets, and I would like anybody that ever sees this that's involved in government to assist us in achieving those goals. And so carbon tax is just a mechanism to help us actually achieve these reductions. Now, if you look at what other countries have done, Zimbabwe being my favorite on the list, because I'm not exactly sure where that carbon tax goes, but they've got a carbon tax of 0.3 cents per liter on the US dollar. South Africa, funny enough, the only thing I can find that we do in terms of carbon tax is on the manufacturing of new vehicles. So, which is quite interesting. And then the biggest shocker to me is China is the biggest contributor. They have actually no carbon tax at all. And they're by far the biggest contributor. India has got 50 rupees. Japan has got something. South Korea. There's a whole lot of countries in Europe that have different forms of carbon tax. And in the United States, Canada, etc. Now, the reason why I think this is important is that there are lots of big companies that naturally, through their processes, and most of those being mining, they produce a lot of carbon, and it's something that's unavoidable. But what they can do to offset their taxes is they can buy carbon credits. Now, I think that it's an absolute must for us everywhere in the world to make sure that when you build a timber house, that you're able to sell some carbon credits. And just imagine, I mean, we've got rebates on putting in solar systems. And for the life of me, I can't understand why there is no sort of tax rebate, or you're not able to sell credits if you build a timber home and you've used all this timber that essentially have a negative carbon footprint. And so I think these taxes will help motivate people, to offset it, because the idea is not to actually pay the tax. You want to avoid the tax, and the process of avoiding the tax will force you to make greener decisions. So that's a little bit of a talk about the environment. So after this, I want to get into timber homes. So this is, after all, what this whole talk is about. Why on earth do we want to build timber homes? So here, I think, is unfortunately the biggest problem. Now, there's this little political joke about the fact that the trees kept on voting for the axe because its handle was made out of timber. And I think this is unfortunately exactly the same kind of problem. You look at a windy house and you think to yourself, wow, okay, at least we're using some timber. But unfortunately, this has created a massive misperception with people. My favorite joke is always, and it's a terrible joke, is that like the only person that should ever live in a timber house is your mother-in-law if it's a windy house. But
yeah, it is terrible. But I've lived in 2 wooden houses, not windy houses.
yes.
And they were the best houses I've ever lived in. But they didn't
Yeah.
look like this at all.
Exactly. And so this, I think, is a big problem, because guys use their windy house and then they think, oh, this thing, it will burn down in a second. When you go in that windy house to get your lawnmower out, which honestly is really what you should be using it for, is to store your gardening equipment, etc. It's so hot inside, you can't imagine that you'd ever want to live in it. And then lastly, it's all untreated timber. And if you don't have proper treatment, then your window house normally will start falling apart, apart in 5 years. And you can't imagine that you'd want to live in a house. And so I just want to talk about timber treatment. It's not, this is not a technical discussion. I do training and stuff on actually building timber homes, and I go into a lot of detail on different types of timber treatment and hazard ratings, etc. But it's extremely important to understand that when you use timber in construction, a timber house that's properly built can last hundreds of years. It is not a temporary structure, it's a permanent structure. And so some of those processes that timber is treated through actually embeds the treatment inside the timber. In South Africa, CCA is the most popular type of treatment, but it also comes in different hazard ratings. So the highest hazard rating that you can get is a level 6, or a hazard rating 6. That piece of timber goes through 2 different treatments to get to hazard rating 6, and it can last in salt water for 50 years minimum, and it will last longer than that. Now, you can imagine that a piece of timber on a jetty in the middle of, a lagoon, it's impressive that it can last that long. So using it in your house, it will last a very long time, but it doesn't last forever. One of the benefits of timber is that you can actually take that timber, you can reuse it. There's other things that you can do with it. It will eventually go back to the earth where it came from, but it can last generations.
And when it goes back to the earth, it gives the carbon back to the earth so that new trees can grow from there.
Absolutely, 100%. And so, what is a timber home? I've put a couple of pictures here just so that you have an idea. This is a timber home. It has fiber cement board on the outside. A timber home doesn't necessarily have to be a house that's completely built out of timber. So if you look at the definition of it, a timber frame building is a versatile, time-tested method of natural building that allows you to create beautiful, sturdy buildings. We in South Africa have something called the SANS 10082, and it is a construction document that was adopted from the European Code. And it's something that allows you to build, there's 2 different construction methods in South Africa. You can either build deemed to satisfy, or you can have a rational design done by an engineer. If you're building deemed to satisfy, you can build up to 2 stories, and you can actually, build something that meets all the criteria that's part of the SANS 10400, which is the building regulations in South Africa. The other point is that timber frame building is not an Agrimo special type of alternate building. There's an actual SANS, SABS document for it. It's a standard construction method in South Africa. You don't need to get special permissions. All municipalities approve it if it's built properly, according to the SANS 10082. Engineers will sign it off. Municipalities will approve it. It is not some sort of funny alternative building method.
Even NHRC is very happy with it.
Yeah. And so, just in terms of, the history of timber frame buildings across the world, here's one in Denmark from 1560. They've literally been around for thousands of years. I actually went to a place called the Rila Monastery in Bulgaria a couple of years ago. And in the mountains is this monastery. It's built in the 1300s. And it was just incredible. There's timber standing right there. It's hundreds of years old. And you can still see the marks where the horses were tied, onto the trees, etc. It had all these natural marks, but it was still standing and there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. So I think between Briarflies and windy houses, we have a very good misperception about timber frame buildings. So it's something that's been around for a very, very long time, all the way from Japan to Europe, to the States. Now, this is an interesting statistic if you're a South African. 70% of the developed world's population lives in timber frame houses. These include lots in the US, Canada, obviously all the Scandinavian countries, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and Japan. So honestly, my question is, do you think that 70% of the world's population would not live in it, or would live in it if there was, something about it that was, uncomfortable, or there were really that many reasons not to do it?
I think if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me.
Yeah, I would like to think so. Then, let's look at a couple of benefits of building in timber. I think one of the first things, and it has to do with a cavity system. So when you build a timber frame wall, it actually has cavities. Those cavities exist in your floor structure, your wall structure, and your roof structure. You can fill that with insulation. It will do two things for you. It will actually control the climate on the inside. So if you want to put an aircon or you want to put a fireplace on the inside of your building and you raise the temperature, your thermal resistance, or your R value, then becomes so high. And all that is it's resisting the change of temperature from the inside to the outside of a product. For example, if it's a wall or it's a floor structure. So in resisting that change, the higher your R value, the higher the resistance for that thermal change that will happen. And if you look at the slide, you'll see that there are basically thermal leaks throughout a normal building. There's the percentages, 30% through your walls, 25% through your roof. Now, this is heat inside your building that's escaping if you're in winter trying to heat up your house. In summer, you've got the opposite thing. You're probably trying to keep your house cool, and you've got this hot sun on your roof, etc., that's now introducing heat into the building. Timber frame buildings is really absolutely amazing at giving us the ability at a low cost. Your what I call your R for R, so your rand value for your R value, which is your thermal resistance, is something that makes a timber frame building, what gives you the ability to very inexpensively to live in comfort. The next slide is just as interesting. So a thermal camera that's pointed at a building will tell you a very interesting story. So there's a timber frame building compared to a brick and mortar building. And you can immediately see how the brick actually, it lights up. It really does transfer the heat. And this is obviously done while it was cold outside and hot inside the building. They were obviously trying to heat the building. And, if you take a piece of steel and you put it in fire or, heat it up, that piece of steel heats up instantly. Same with brick, anything like that. It's got very low ability to resist the change in the thermal, or the thermal change in temperature. Okay, so some of the other benefits of building. The number one thing for me as well is that it gives you the ability to pre-manufacture. There's a discussion, well, I've been in discussions a couple of times where people have said, but what about labor? Are you not actually reducing labor by pre-manufacturing? Now, it's not at all that. What pre-manufacturing helps you is, in South Africa, our housing crisis is so big. Even if we adopted timber frame building and started mass producing like at 100 houses a day, which apparently there's a factory in Finland that can produce wall panels to that quantity per day, we would still take years to actually meet the housing deficit that we've got. So pre-manufacturing just means that you're able to manufacture a product and send it to someone that still has to put it together on site. You still need to do your finishes. There's still a lot of the labor components that we have in South Africa, plumbers, electricians, etc., that are able to participate in this process. It's just that through pre-manufacturing, you can really bump up the volumes a lot. And so speed of construction is also affected by this process of pre-manufacturing, because if you get to a site and there's a truck that delivers already completed wall panels, floor structures, etc., and you can just put them together on site, you limit the amount of time on site. And anybody who's in construction will know that it costs a lot of money to have teams on site building one house only. I would personally rather have my same team build 100 houses a year than just build 5 houses a year, because that's a total capacity that they have in one construction method versus the other. I think the other thing that's really, really amazing in timber frame buildings is because you can build in a factory, your quality control is fantastic. You're able to actually, in a controlled environment, check the quality. When you're building on site and you're actually starting to build with bricks right from the bottom, all your quality control happens in the dust, in the sun, out there on your construction site. You can't introduce this quality control beforehand, but in a factory, you can actually create perfect wall structures. You can install windows that are sealed. You don't have to do it on site. You can install doors, pre-install the doors, etc. Then another big benefit is fire protection. There's a lot of misperception about fire in buildings. And just to very briefly explain it, again, that example of a brick or steel, take brick or steel, you heat it up, it gets to that same temperature throughout the material very quickly. So if you've got a brick building burning down at about 800-900 degrees, the concrete disintegrates and the entire building will collapse instantly at one point. It becomes structurally unsafe. One of the things that happen with timber is timber will burn from the outside. It's got a specific char rate. And we can know that if we use pieces of timber that are large enough, when they start burning, the inside structurally remains in place. So it doesn't collapse. It slowly burns from the outside. So your actual time to evacuate the building is a lot longer in a timber frame building that was built properly. So it's a misperception that because timber can burn, that it's a fire risk. It's a safer building with a better, with a longer duration until it's actually going to structurally collapse.
Yes, I've seen that too, because in the your typical brick and mortar building or concrete building, the rebar inside the columns melt.
Yes,
and then
exactly.
the structural integrity goes immediately. Then that's when it just collapses, kaboom.
Yeah, 100%.
And you don't get that with timber. That little bit that it burns on the surface. We all know, because we braai in South Africa, and we have fireplaces. You know how long it takes for a log to burn through. It takes quite a while.
No, exactly. Especially you go on a hunting trip or something, you take a big log like that and you think you're going to burn it the next morning. It probably still hasn't burned properly. And then I think another thing that's very important is, at the moment, it's fairly expensive to build timber homes in South Africa. And the reason for it is that we are currently, it is trying to compare Ford building thousands of cars in a factory per year and building a Rolls-Royce by hand. Currently, timber construction in South Africa is done on an individual basis, house by house. So we have very similar costs to building a brick and mortar, but we can massively reduce the cost of building timber homes if we start mass producing in factories. So if you're building thousands of houses out of a factory, and the only thing the guys need to do on site is put the buildings together, install the electricity, plumbing, etc., your cost of production will come down significantly.
And isn't it also true that because it takes so much quicker, I mean, time also equals cost. So you will incur quite a bit of time saving by using timber. And that I mean, your project management fees, the professional team the time that you need to spend on site becomes much less.
Yeah, your P's and G's come down completely. It's all of those items are covered by that, and it does make a big difference. So yeah, it's all around. It can be. We've actually taken 2 buildings, and there was something that was initiated by the DTIC, and we've had a QS that did a calculation on both. And the timber building was slightly cheaper, and it was exactly that. It was because it was quicker to build. So all your P's and G's and your overheads across the project came down a little bit. But for all intents and purposes, they could be a lot cheaper if they were mass manufactured.
Mass produced.
Yeah. Okay, and then I think So I've put a little project here that we did in a place called Hot as Hell. And I think that's a very good example of the fact that timber buildings, you can build them throughout the world. You know, Australia has got some pretty harsh conditions. And the number one building methodology in Australia is timber frame buildings. So, you know, all the way from there to the Scandinavian countries where it is -30, -40, again, timber frame buildings, absolutely the shining stars in terms of construction. Because you've got cavity walls, you can control the temperature. The one downside to timber buildings is if you're in a very dry climate and you've got exposed timber on the outside, they do need a lot of maintenance. If they're pressure treated, they're not going to be eaten by termites, they're not going to rot. But what will happen is that your timber dries out. And so there's additional maintenance to oil it just to keep it, from cracking. So my personal experience is it's still a timber frame building, but if you're in an environment that's very harsh, I would recommend that you rather put a fiber cement board. There's a local manufacturer of fiber cement board. We also bring in some boards into South Africa. And I think that actually it's a thin layer on the outside of the building, but that actually then prevents any maintenance on the building, but you've still built a house that's predominantly a timber building because your
Yes,
walls
inside it will
inside
be
out.
timber. Everywhere
Yes,
can be
everywhere.
timber, your internal walls. It can even have the look, timber look. I mean, you can paint timber,
Yes,
but I wouldn't. I just love the natural colors of timber. But then outside it would look like some of those houses that you showed us, as opposed
yes,
to this fantastic lodge, which you can see it's the exposed timber.
yes. So I guess that of all the things I can think of in terms of timber is that there is a certain amount of maintenance that you do have to do if you have exposed timber. I think that's important to note.
Okay.
It's maybe a little bit too technical for this presentation, but another thing that's extremely important when you do use timber is that your timber needs to be kiln dried properly. One of the things that happen in South Africa is that we buy timber that goes through a treatment plant. That treatment plant would typically treat at CCA, which is a waterborne treatment. The timber will come back very wet from the sawmill once it's been through the treatment plant. You need to either pin stack it and let it dry properly, or ideally put it in a kiln and dry it at the correct rate, so that when you're using timber, that it's already dry, and then leave it on site for a while to climatize, because timber will climatize naturally to the environment. There's a big difference between building a timber home in Mozambique on the beach and building a timber home in the desert, or hot as hell, for example, because they're going to actually climatize differently. You know, it's going to be
Yes.
a lot hotter and drier in one area, but the timber will climatize to the area where you're going to use it. And then the timber is a lot better to work with and it's a lot more stable. So we look at remote locations. Here's another project, and I would tell you that building something on the beach will test any construction method. If you've ever been on holiday and you've walked into a brick and mortar house right by the beach and you get that, I don't even know what it's in English, that muff smell
Yeah.
and mildew.
Molding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that moldy mildew
Yeah.
smell. You know, that's a typical example of one of the downsides of being down at the coast is you've got a high moisture content. These are all things that will test the building. And so, managing the moisture content in a building, in a timber frame building, is so easy because it naturally breathes. And, I would go so far as to saying that for your spiritual and mental well-being, it's a lot better to live in a timber frame building because it just naturally breathes better. Your quality of air, everything inside your building is going to be a lot better. Especially if you're down at the coast. So without further ado, we can have a look at a little video of a project that we did in Mozambique.
Beautiful.
Okay, so just a very short video. This was such an interesting project because we had pre-manufactured everything. We had shop drawings, and we manufactured them in Johannesburg. We loaded all the components, and on site they had to put together, I think at the end it was 46 buildings, restaurants, staff buildings. It's an entire operational lodge. It's at Pontamambene. You can go there anytime. It's open to the public. It's an absolutely amazing place. You drive through the reserve for about 3-4 hours in between elephants. It's just an amazing experience, but extremely remote. And they did not have one single issue with all of these beams. It was a post and beam system with all these beams fitting together because, again, quality control we could do in the factory. We could sort out all the issues in Johannesburg. By the time it got to site, the guys literally took it like a Meccano set and they could put it together. And like I said, within 18 months, this entire lodge was built. We did it with a Mozambican partner involved that put it together. We pre-manufactured and they put it together on site. But it's for an organization called Peace Parks, and it was absolutely an amazing success story.
Looks beautiful. I'd love to go there.
Thank you. It is very nice. Then just, a couple of other items in terms of building with timber. There's a big misperception that people have. What is a forest and what is a plantation?
So, I see you speak towards the deforestation because that's one thing that we really want to avoid. But yes, this isn't that at all.
Yeah, so not at all. So basically, there's something called the FSC. That's the Forest Stewardship Council. They've put together regulations, and I'm going to only talk about plantations. A forest is something that naturally occurs. We've got, teak and yellow wood and black wood and all sorts of exotic timbers naturally growing in forests. Like, for example, we have in Knysna. This is not what we're promoting at all. Predominantly, we're promoting sustainable plantations in South Africa from a structural perspective. It's mostly pine trees that we plant. And while we're on the subject, I want to just address water scarcity in South Africa because there's a lot of issues where people are concerned about the fact that we're a water scarce country and now we're adding plantations. But one of the best things about pine, especially compared to other tree species, is that we actually plant them in mist belts. And so when you've got a constant mist in an area where you've planted, the way that the leaves are shaped, that water is actually captured out of the mist and used by the tree. So it has very little impact on groundwater. And so in a country like South Africa, we still have a lot of scope for pine plantations without affecting our water scarcity in the country.
Is it not also true that, although the tree takes the water from below the earth, it still breathes out moisture? Yes. So it gives that moisture back to the earth, to the sky.
It does. The moisture doesn't escape. H2O stays.
H2O, it's a closed system.
It's a closed system. It stays within the system. So yes, absolutely not an issue for us in South Africa. We still have a lot of scope for plantations, and just one of the things about an FSC forest is that for every tree that they use, they plant 3 more trees. So you can imagine, from removing carbon from the atmosphere, from a sustainability, once you've mined cement and you've taken it out of an area, it's gone. You've used it in the building, lime, it's removed. A tree, you use a tree for anything. You plant 3 more trees, come back in 15 to 25 years, you've got the same tree to do the same thing again. It's a totally sustainable, it's an amazing construction resource. The other thing is that the weight to strength ratio of timber is better than any other construction material. So it's just an interesting little fact.
Oh, I must add something there, Werner. When I attended the wood conference in the Cape, I was surprised to hear from our York Timber chair. They explained that South African timber, especially our pines, capture more carbon than European timber because our trees are faster growing. And so they grow a lot faster, during which time they capture more carbon. And then when we cut them down at that particular point in time, when to harvest them, they've captured more carbon than their equivalent in the same time period in the European countries where it's a lot colder. So
That's
our South African timber is better in its embodied carbon than than the overseas timber.
That's absolutely fascinating. So in the same period of time where the tree in Europe would grow for 75 years, you're doing that within 15 to 25 years, but you're
Yes.
storing the same amount of carbon. So yeah, you're speeding up the process. That's
Yeah.
it's an amazing statistic. You know, the other thing I've heard people have a concern about is that they say that, yes, because our trees grow so fast, the timber quality is not as good. It's a total misperception. There's two organizations that actually are involved in grading timber. One is SATAS and the other one is the SABS. And through that grading process, they will take a proper piece of pine that was grown in a tree that was fast growing, and they'll take its properties and grade it. Like, for example, most of the timber that we use in South Africa is graded to level S5. Now, if you take a piece of S5 timber, there are span tables that'll tell you exactly what the shear will be, what the deflection on that piece of timber would be, where you can use it. And again, referring back to the SANS 10082, there's absolutely no problem using that timber. So it's a big misperception that fast-growing trees are inferior in quality. Yes, a tree that is slow growing will maybe have a higher grading and could be used for something. But as long as you use the correct graded piece of timber for the correct application, it's not an issue at all in construction. Okay, and then just the last thing in terms of governance, you know, if you look at the three legs of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and if we just look at the environmental side of it, it's amazing how timber construction just ticks so many boxes in terms of proper corporate, you know, in terms of proper governance. You know, you look at climate change strategy, you look at biodiversity, even water efficiency, energy efficiency, as I said, the insulation of buildings, carbon is something that we looked at, environmental management systems. I mean, it literally across the board. And then in terms of governance and social, there are a lot of items there that it can tick too. You know, I think one of the things that's very good about the timber industry is it actually creates job opportunities through a very wide industry span, all the way from working in the forest to the sawmills to treatment plants, right through to the final usage of that timber, whether that's in construction, whether it's in you know, other areas of timber usage. So it ticks a lot of boxes in terms
There's
of
a long
governance.
value chain.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Okay, so away from the benefits of building in timber, it'd be quite interesting to see what the rest of the world is actually doing. So there's an organization in Europe for architects, and they wrote something very interesting a while ago where they said that, you know, for the last number of years, it was really a big revolution in terms of using steel and glass, and concrete formed a big part of what we did as architects in terms of design. But timber has now become the most interesting product for architects across Europe. And for that, you know, I think it's something that we want to be on that train. We want to be on that same journey. The technologies have developed a lot in the last couple of years. You know, cross-laminated timbers have made such a big impact because we can now use timber in ways that we never thought was possible before. And a great example is a structure that they built out of cross-laminated timbers in Spain, in Seville, called with this what's called CLT. And this monument is just such an incredible work of art, and just the dimensions of it to show you what's possible in timber and in CLT. Absolutely beautiful. I hope to go and see it myself one day. And just on the same subject, because we've got CLT, and CLT is launched in South Africa, you know, it's a technology that's going to become widely available in South Africa. Now, in 2022, they completed, which I think may still be the tallest building, timber building in the world. So it's 86.6 meters high in Wisconsin, and which is absolutely amazing. Now, you look at this building, and it just looks like a normal brick and mortar building or a concrete building that was, you know, casted through shuttering, etc. But it's actually it's a timber building. It's extremely impressive what we can actually achieve now as architects, engineers, and builders.
And property developers.
Yes, and property developers, of course. You know, I think the opportunity in South Africa for property developers to really look at green technologies is amazing because of our electricity crisis, because of, water scarcity, because there are so many components in South Africa that actually lean itself to proper green developments. We
And by
should really,
utilizing a lot more timber, I mean, your indoor air quality just increases tremendously. The environmental performance increases tremendously. So in all aspects, the timber improves your buildings. It's not something that you want to use just like adding a little bit of timber in the facade, in the entrance foyer or so. You want to use it as much as possible, internal walling, external,
Yeah. And from a commercial perspective, while we're talking about if you're a developer or you're somebody that your building is built predominantly for a financial return,
correct.
It makes a huge difference if you can launch a lodge in half the time and have it functional and producing an income. If you have a commercial building that you can put up in half the time and start getting the income, it just financially makes sense. It's not even only about how good it is for the environment, but there's such a big commercial benefit to building in timber. And then just comparing a couple of countries, again, like we said before, 70% of people in the world, in first world countries, actually live in timber buildings. There's a couple of countries there, Australia, more than 90% of the building stock is timber frame. Canada, the same. Ireland and the UK, countries which typically had brick and mortar buildings, they're already sitting at 10 and 8%. You look at Japan, 45%. And then obviously your Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, all those places, you're sitting at 90%. And then obviously the US. I think most people are aware of the fact that the US have a lot of timber frame buildings. So yeah, very interesting statistics. Now this is a little bit of an environmental slide, but I think it was such an interesting concept to look at. So there's a book that a guy called Gunther Pauli had written. He's a Belgian entrepreneur. And he just spoke about mindset. And he said, in the old green ecology, so in the way that people try to look at green and implementing green, there were these very funny ideas about the fact that resources are scarce, things are limited. It was so fear-based. And what he said is, it's very interesting that the new way of looking at ecology is that when we start looking at the fact that resources are infinite, you can keep on replanting trees for as long as the earth exists. It's not a resource that's going to run out. When things happen, it's actually a self-correcting system. The earth is correcting itself. It's always trying to be in equilibrium. It's not something, it's a very easy thing for us to start having a different view. I think, unfortunately, worldwide, we've had a fear-based political agenda, and it's completely unnecessary. It's an amazing opportunity for us to look at becoming more green, living in better quality houses, improving our quality of life. And it's not necessarily a thing of, oh, I need to live in a timber house because I'm so scared I'm destroying the earth. It's an amazing opportunity for us to explore. Anyway, this is it's quite interesting when we start looking at something from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think this speaks also to the circularity perspective, where you can keep on using and reusing, and it's a material that is very, very suited to that. And you can, it's like we said, it's a cycle. So that it's just not just the environmental cycle. There's also the usage of the material cycle, the building cycles, and the cycles of our lives. We change the use of buildings, and it's easier to do that in a timber building.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very valid point. So also just looking at some statistics in the UK, we looked earlier at the statistics where it was sitting at about 10% of buildings in the UK, but they're expecting that to rise to 27%. So that's traditionally a country that they were building in brick and mortar and stone, actually, before brick and mortar. And even in those countries, there's a big move towards building in timber frame. And all across Europe, they interviewed 1,200 architects, and they all expect that there will be a big increase in timber frame buildings across countries in Europe. where it's traditionally been a lot of Scandinavian countries, but it's going across the board.
So what you're telling us is timber is the new concrete.
Yes, exactly. Timber is the new concrete, especially with things like crosslam, because
Yes.
it just gives us the ability to do things that we could only do in concrete and steel before. And so the last part of this conversation about international trends is just that, you know, it's already in place in Europe. You can actually buy a house that has an energy rating. And this is a very, very interesting concept. And it would be nice if you went onto private property or wanted to buy a house and you could actually see what the energy rating of that house was. So again, in timber frame, it's so much easier to regulate it and to create a house that costs very little in terms of heating and cooling costs to create that pleasant environment for yourself. So I'm looking forward. Lots of European countries have it already. You buy a house, you know what the energy rating is. And it's something that I think we would really be able to benefit from in South Africa.
I agree.
I know it doesn't get, I think the misperception is that because it doesn't get as hot and as cold, I think we can get away with it, but we don't know what we're sacrificing in terms of, you know, the financial cost of keeping our homes regulated, but just in terms of quality of living as well.
No, most definitely.
Then,
Sure, but very, very enlightening, that they have already got that. Because in South Africa, it's coming. We've got a year and a half still to go before all our buildings bigger than 20,000 squares. No, wait a minute. Bigger than 2,000 squares.
yes,
has to have the electrical performance certificates, but
yeah,
most residential homes are smaller than that, so we won't be kept to task to do that yet. But imagine if you could, and you could sell your house with such a certificate worth a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. You immediately add value to your house.
Yeah.
So, okay. And then I think, you know, just something interesting about in the South African context, let's just take it back to timber usage in South Africa. You know, lots of people wonder about what we do in South Africa. And so just to put it into perspective, timber in part of the process of you know, growing and selling and using timber contributes about 600 billion US dollars to the worldwide GDP, which represents quite a big number. I mean, it's a very impressive industry. But even in South African context, we contribute about $750 million of GDP through our plantations and timber usage. And that's quite a significant number. We really do have a lot of plantations in South Africa, and it's an impressive industry. If we just compare, and again, this is not forest. I have to make the point. This is not natural forest. These are plantations. The statistics are a little bit old, but I think they haven't changed that much because trees grow fairly slowly. So they're probably still relevant. China, for their sins being the biggest contributor to carbon pollution, at least have the biggest plantations in the world. And but I'm quite impressed by the fact that South Africa, you know, they've got 1.2 million hectares compared to what's at 46 million hectares in China. So we have significant plantations in South Africa, which is very impressive. And so here's a little graph of what's happened in terms of plantation areas from the 1980s. And you'll see it peaked there around the 90s. And one of the reasons is that we've had paper and pulp. We don't print as much anymore. We don't use, no, we don't use as much paper as we used to before. And I think also we had this terrible campaign that people believed that if you use paper to print, you know, somehow it's bad for the environment, where actually it was fantastic for the environment.
Yeah, it's renewable.
Renewable. So use paper as much as you can. It's you know,
You
it's
could make good money from recycling it as well.
exactly. And so the other thing I think that you notice in this is that we've actually had bigger plantations, you know, at 1.5 million hectares. And if we're down to 1.2, it means that we still have the ability to replant those. It's an industry that has so much potential. And the other thing is that it's not that difficult to catch up. Honestly, the modern trees in South Africa, you know, the guys from York would have maybe alluded to that, but within 15 years, some of these trees are being harvested. So we can catch
13
up.
to 15, you can cut them down. Yeah.
So literally, in the next 15 years, we can make a huge impact. and regain at least some of the plantations that we had and actually grow them further, since we now know that it's not going to as adversely affect water scarcity as some people would like us believe. And then I think the other thing that's really important in terms of the future of timber construction of Africa, I mentioned to you when I first met you that I think the Tesla model, where they first built celebrity cars and really nice looking cars to get people to become excited about electric cars and then eventually started mass producing. I think we in South Africa, we really need to make sure that when we do build timber buildings, that they are of the highest quality and the highest standards. We as a company certainly strive towards that. I would rather make very little money, but make sure that the buildings exceed everybody's expectations, and definitely my clients. And anybody that goes, we get a lot of referrals. People often phone me and say, oh, I was in a house that you guys built, and I definitely want to have a timber frame house as well. Because once they experience something that was properly done, it sells itself very easily. And so,
So it becomes an aspirational item. It's like thinking, wow, maybe I can, it's like you aspire towards Tesla. Yes, you're not going to end up in a Tesla, but you might end up driving an electric vehicle that's a lot more affordable.
yes.
But the same here, to change that perception that timber equals Wendy house, no.
Yeah.
So yeah, start setting the bar high. I fully agree with what you're saying there.
And we've the second generation timber frame builders in South Africa, and we have built for some of the wealthiest people in South Africa. So if they're choosing timber buildings and they have money to buy as much cement and concrete and bricks as they want, they're still choosing timber because they perceive it as being an absolute luxury item to have and a luxury home to live in. And I think if you've ever been in one of these proper houses, and this is one area where I think the Western Cape, they really are, we can be very proud of what the guys have done in the last 50 years in the Western Cape. They are the most beautiful timber houses that have been built in the Western Cape for a very long time. We're sitting somewhere around probably just less than 1% of buildings in South Africa are timber frame buildings, and most of them are in the Western Cape.
Wow.
But they are absolutely magnificent. So yeah, next time you drive through Cape Town or something, have a look around, and once you know what they look like, you'll be surprised how many timber buildings there are.
But you don't just build in South Africa and Mozambique. You've also built in other countries, eh?
Yes, so we've built all the way from the Congo, mostly Africa, and one of the reasons is that it's such an easy product to transport. So I've built a house in the French Congo, for example, where we actually packed up the entire house into containers, and we shipped it to the harbor, and we took it by truck to the building site. And we built a complete house in the middle of, and I promise you, in the middle of nowhere, next to the Congo River. We built a house because timber frame just leans itself towards that. So we've built all the way from Angola, Congo, Zambia, Botswana, obviously, as you said, Mozambique, Lesotho. We've really have a footprint across Africa, and it's always the same thing. Timber, one of the other things that we often don't talk about, despite the fact that it's so easy to get material into a remote area, and it's lightweight. A truck can only take that much weight. If I load 34 tons, which is pretty much the maximum you can put onto a superlink of timber, it's going to give me a lot more volume than if I go and load bricks of 32 tons onto a superlink.
Yeah, so like you say, you can fit the entire house, the construction material of the entire house onto the one super link.
Yes.
But there would be no way that you could do that with the entire house if you would do it built from brick and mortar.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. It just your truck wouldn't be full, but the weight would just be
the weight. Yes, because of the weight.
So we've done an engineer has done a calculation for me comparing a brick and mortar building to a timber frame building, and the timber frame building was 1/10 of the weight of the brick and mortar building. So that's an amazing statistic. It's a lightweight but very durable and strong product. So therefore, one of the other areas where timber frame is ideal is when you've got very poor soil conditions. So if you're building on a slope where you would have to have done a lot of cut and fill, or if your soil conditions are so bad that you would have had to build a massive raft foundation, that's no longer required in timber frame building because it weighs 1/10. Or maybe the soil conditions would be so bad that you have to pile until you get to a rock bed, which could cost you millions. And then you're only at platform level and you need to start. So there's another massive benefit, and I think this is why we've built in such remote areas often, is because, you know, the soil conditions are often quite poor.
Yeah, that would typically be a situation in a sort of a very arid climate like at Hotazel in the desert type sandy soils or collapsible sands. Then this would be a better solution. You wouldn't have to do rafts, you wouldn't have to do piling.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You do punch pad foundations underneath poles. Typically, when you're a meter down into the ground, you get to ground that's stable enough. Remember, your timber frame building can naturally move. It floats.
Yeah.
It's like putting a lot of pegs in the ground. It won't slip down, you know, the side of a slope or anything like that, because it's literally like having a whole lot of pegs under your building, keeping it in place. And then obviously with the reduced weight, it helps a lot. Okay, so those are just some of my thoughts in terms of timber frame construction in South Africa. So something that I found interesting is there's something called the Worldwide Happiness Survey that's done once a year. And you won't believe it, but the country that won last year and has been in the top 3 probably more often than anybody else is Finland. And so I thought, well, that's a place where people are so happy. Let's actually look at their sustainable urban development plan. And one of the main items is wood construction. Now we know that more than 90% of the houses that they build is actually timber frame, which comes back to the fact that I believe for your mental and spiritual well-being, a timber frame house is a very good place to be. But I think if, you know, considering many factors, it's quite interesting to look at their sustainable urban development. Many of the items, and you know, if you look under healthy cities, they look at healthy indoor and outdoor spaces. It's really important stuff. You know, how many people in South Africa suffer from poor air quality? You know, pollution, hay fever, all sorts of things, because they have houses that are not well built, not well sealed. If a house is well sealed from the environment, you don't necessarily have to have all your windows open and it's hot and let, you know, the environment. Only 15% of a house's air needs to be circulated for it to be a healthy environment. And so I think that we can really benefit from looking at Finland's sustainable urban development plan and you know, copy what they've done. After all, it seems like they're very happy with it.
Yeah, it's amazing, the World Happiness Index. Some of the countries I have shown some of my students this, that some countries, when they have their SONA, their budget speeches,
Yeah.
they prioritize on happiness.
Yeah,
So it would be a measure in their actual fiscus, in the budget speech.
that's
And they
amazing.
would promote happiness through methods like this
Yeah.
to improve their, you know, their country. So yeah,
Yeah.
we're still a way off, but let's believe we're going to get there.
Yeah, we should always strive towards
Yes.
something better, right? Yeah, that's amazing. So we're getting to the end of the presentation before everybody falls asleep. It's not interesting enough. So I think, first of all, education is extremely important. Talks like this, being available, you know, at conferences, spreading the message and addressing these misperceptions about timber frame buildings, it's really important. It's a solution for us in South Africa beyond what we can perceive. All the way from low-cost housing, mass manufacturing houses. It's just such an incredible, amazing opportunity. And for anybody interested in getting involved, it's such a growing industry. It's, you know, it's fairly small compared to its potential. So I think if it's an industry that you get involved with, you know that you're going to be part of a big growth spurt that's going to keep on
Yes.
happening worldwide, not only in South Africa. And also having those type of skills you can take with you to any other country in the world. We, after all, as I said before, we're one earth, really, one place that we have to all live in and make comfortable for each of us. You know, there's it's so off the subject, but you know that some of the Sahara sand actually gets blown right across to the Amazon, and it actually creates nutrition for the trees in the Amazon. So if you don't think the world is connected,
No,
it
it's
really,
connected.
really,
Yeah.
truly connected in every single way.
And it is a rising tide. The whole notion of using wood and using timber in construction, that's a rising tide. I've seen how it's starting to increase all over the
Yeah.
world. So it's a very good place to get into now when it's starting, and then you can ride out that wave as it grows.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Yeah, I think the other thing just that I made a note here is that we need to really, in terms of public infrastructure, we really need timber frame buildings to start becoming part of public infrastructure. You know what, if you go into an area and you build a hospital and you build the schools and you build things out of proper timber frame, and again, I'm not referring to, don't go and put up a whole lot of windy houses. You're really doing damage to your industry and you're not doing anybody a favor. But if you actually build proper timber frame buildings as public structures where people can go um, to a building and experience how beautiful. I mean, you guys at the university have the most magnificent building. Anybody ever wants to experience how beautiful a timber building can be, they must come and visit you guys. It's for anybody who sees this who hasn't seen your building, it's absolutely stunning and something that you guys can be very proud of.
Which building?
Your what's it called? Your Future Africa building.
Oh, Future Africa, yes.
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 So,
Yes,
yeah, it's not
that's it,
completely
exactly.
not completely a
So
timber
much.
building.
Oh, it is a
but
beautiful building.
it's
Yeah. No, most
yeah,
definitely.
it's inspirational.
It is inspirational.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure, and thank you for participating with me in this presentation. And I trust it was interesting and something that everybody would be able to benefit from.
Thank you very much. And then what I would like to just end also from my side with to say thanks for educating us. That's what we need, for making us aware that we've had misperceptions and that we can be doing a lot more for the environment, for the well-being of people, the well-being of the environment as well, for better governance, build faster, shorter time of construction, and there's already cost savings as well to tenant your building faster and get that income stream flowing earlier on in the process. It makes a lot of sense. And thanks so much for showing us how that can be done with wood. So Vanna, just to end off, I would like to share with all my students who would be watching this and students from other faculties that would also be watching this, I would like to share your Instagram profile, because I found so many nice little videos on there where you're busy showing what you do. So don't you want to just tell us, and then I'll also pop it into their data repository, where to find you on Instagram.
Perfect. No, thank you very much. So we are Green Block. So on Instagram, if you go search for Green Block, but if you put the link in there, that'll make it easier.
I'll do that for them.
Yeah, and if so that'll be great. If you go there, so we try and regularly make little videos. Some of them are little technical videos. It's how to do things. Some of it is hopefully just inspirational. Some of the stuff that we've built when we finish projects. And we continually add content, and it's really there to educate. We like to share all our trade secrets. We'd like to tell people how to install windows so they don't leak. We want to tell people how to build showers in timber buildings that don't leak, and we want to share as much information as possible. We're very passionate about what we do, and we believe that the industry has got so much potential. I'd rather be part of the growth cycle than try and keep it for myself.
Thank you. And thank you once again for this awesome presentation.
Thank you so much.
All right, so we're going to end off there, and I'm going to stop the recording. Let me just do that. There we go. Bye.